So on our first stop on our psychological field trip is to the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland. Watson was interested in taking Pavlov's research on conditioning further, so he wanted to demonstrate that emotional reactions could be classically conditioned in humans. Initially, he exposed a 9-month-old baby in the experiment known as Little Albert to a bunch of stimuli such as a white rabbit, a bunny, a monkey, and masks, and saw that the boy showed no fear to the objects. Watson exposed Little Albert to the white rat again while making a loud noise by hitting a metal pipe with a hammer, causing the child to cry. After repeatedly pairing the white rat with the loud noise, Little Albert cried at just the sight of the white rat. Now, Watson and Rosalie didn't only show that emotional responses could be conditioned in people, but stimulus generalization can occur as well. See, after Little Albert's conditioning, he displayed fear towards other similar white objects. So, it would be beneficial for psych students to visit Johns Hopkins to see the university where one of the most influential experiments took place for behaviorism. They'll also be able to compare and contrast how the ethical guidelines for psychological experiments has changed throughout the years. Let's now take the bus from Baltimore to our country's capital, Washington, D.C., to visit the APA building. The APA created ethical codes to make the practice of psychology safer. It began to teach psychologists how to practice psychology in an ethical manner. One ethical code created by the APA was that the psychologist must avoid harming his or her human subjects, and the experiment must not intend to inflict pain upon the subject. Another ethical code is that the subject involved must be fully debriefed if deception was utilized in the experiment. A final ethical code created by the APA is the necessity for confidential information to remain, well, confidential. By visiting this site, psych students will be able to learn in further depth all the changes the APA brought to psychology to make psychology a safer science. We are traveling to the small town of Riceville, Iowa, to introduce to you this experiment of prejudice and discrimination. A local teacher, Jane Elliott, was shocked about the previous day of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, and she decided to scrap her entire Native American lesson, stop making a teepee, to teach about discrimination. Her idea was to show the children what it was like to be discriminated against or be the intimidator. She asked them if they would like to see how it was to be discriminated, followed by a chorus of yeahs. So, Mrs. Elliott proceeded to tell them that the brown-eyed people are smarter and cleaner than the blue-eyed people. This led to hatred towards any blue-eyed children. Even the teacher was discriminated against. One student claimed, "Hey, Mrs. Elliott, how come you're the teacher if you got blue eyes?" a brown-eyed boy asked. Before she could answer, another boy piped up, "If she didn't have blue eyes, she'd be the principal or the superintendent." The lesson that Jane Elliott taught to the psych world is that discrimination is taught at any age, especially in children. This happened after the first day, when the blue-eyed people were superior. Let's move on to the cheese state, Wisconsin, where we'll take a tour of the laboratory of Harry Harlow at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Harlow's controversial experiment, where he separated infant monkeys from their mothers, and then arranged for the young animals to be raised by two types of surrogate mothers. One mother was made out of bare wire mesh, and the other was a wire mother covered with soft terry cloth. Harlow's first observation was that the monkeys who had a choice of the mothers spent far more time clinging to the terry cloth surrogates, even when their physical nourishment came from the bottles mounted on the bare wire mothers. This suggested that attachment was not primarily about hunger or thirst. The importance of this experiment involves two ideals. One is that contact comfort is dominated by any physical needs, and secondly, that the use of animals in this experiment calls for an amendment to the APA for animal use in experiments. The Stanford Prison Experiment, located at Stanford University, showed that any person, regardless of personality type, can assume any role depending on the circumstances. Zimbardo was able to prove that a situation has the power to manipulate and influence any human's behavior. In the experiment, Zimbardo had his participants be either a guard or a prisoner. Nothing was done to determine the personality type of the participants, so who was a guard and who was a prisoner was randomly decided. Within a very short time, both guards and prisoners were settling into their roles, with the guards adopting theirs quickly. After only 6 days, the experiment had to be shut down because the guards were being too abusive to the prisoners. The conclusion of the experiment was that people will readily conform to the social roles they are expected to play, especially if the roles are strongly stereotyped. The prison environment was an important factor in creating the guards' brutal behavior because none of the participants who acted as guards showed sadistic tendencies before the study. By visiting this site, psych students can deepen their knowledge in social psychology and better understand how a situation can affect any person's behavior negatively and cause them to commit acts out of their character.
Vienna, Austria, a place where Sigmund Freud pioneered the psychoanalytic perspective, one of the major perspectives in psychology. He was one of the most influential psychologists, although most of what he discovered has either been disproven or is unable to be proven empirically. He contributed to psychology many different concepts about our unconscious. For example, the id, the ego, and the superego, and how these elements of the human mind interact and affect a person's behavior. He also founded free association, transference, as well as dream analysis to help his patients discover their unconscious struggles that affect them in their everyday life. He also theorized about the psychosexual stages of development, and he concluded that if a child doesn't smoothly pass through each stage, a fixation could occur, which would affect the person in their adult life. Freud also created the theory of defense mechanisms, which explains how the ego works to reduce anxiety. Freud's theories are decent at describing behavior, yet cannot predict them, and since most of his theories cannot be proven empirically, his findings cannot be viewed as the most reliable or valid of theories. However, he is still one of the most important and influential figures in psychology. Although he was wrong in many aspects of his work, it provided a basis for other psychologists to begin and helped other psychologists discover truths about the human psyche. It would be beneficial for psych students to visit this place because it would give those students deeper insight into one of psychologists' major perspectives. Wilhelm Wundt's breakthrough of studying human emotions, behaviors, and thoughts formed the beginning of the formal teachings of psychology in Leipzig, Germany. Through this, psychology students would not be going through this extravagant journey. Wundt formed this first formal laboratory to further expand the knowledge of psychology and the mind that has been missed by philosophers of his time. Wundt's experiments would lead to the perspective of structuralism. Structuralism took place of elementism. The purpose of this was to utilize conscious experience to break it down into basic conscious elements.
Allons-y, on to the beautiful country of France, specifically to the University of Strasbourg. This was the beginning of the desire to study the human psyche. Franz Gall showed interest in the human mind and created phrenology, the detailed study of the shape and size of the cranium as a supposed indication of character and mental abilities. Although he was incorrect in thinking the bumps on a person's head reveal their personality traits, Gall was correct in thinking different areas of the brain controlled different aspects of the human psyche, which was at the time called localization. His concept of localization was actually proven correct by Paul Broca when he demonstrated the existence of a speech center in the brain. Psych students should visit the University of Strasbourg because they will be able to see the place where the desire to study psychology began and psychology's roots before William Wundt. Fun tidbit, Gall actually came before psychology became real fancy and gave names for different perspectives like functionalism and structuralism. At Yale University, Stanley Milgram conducted one of the most famous studies on obedience in psychology. His entire experiment focused on the conflict between an ordinary person's obedience to authority and their personal conscience. Now, Milgram's motivation for conducting this experiment was due to war criminals' justification for their acts of genocide during World War II, which was obedience, that they were simply following orders. In his experiment, he had teachers and learners. The participants were always the teacher, while Milgram's confederates were always the learners, but the participants didn't know that was the case. The participants were told to shock the learner each time they answered a question incorrectly after the learner had learned a list of word pairs. The shocks went from 15 volts, which was a slight shock, to 450 volts, which was a dangerous, severe shock. 2/3 of the participants continued to lead. So Milgram concluded that ordinary people are apt to follow orders given by an authority figure, even to the extent of killing an innocent person. Through this experiment, Milgram was able to create Milgram's agency theory. which suggests that people actually have two states of behavior when in a social situation, one of which is the autonomous state, where people direct their own actions and take responsibility for the results of their actions, and the agentic state, where people's actions are directed by others and so they pass off the responsibilities of their actions to the commander. It would be beneficial for psych students at Yale University because they will get to, once again, see how ethical guidelines have evolved from the 60s to the present, as well as further their understanding on obedience and how it affects ordinary people in committing atrocities.
Wilhelm Wundt. What happened? It moved!
This was the beginning of the desire to study the human psyche. This man showed interest. I didn't write his name!
So this is just me recording this stupid thing, right? And I can just stop the recording at any time.
Look pain upon the subject. Another code is that the subject involved that jingle's probably in there.